You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. As we wrap up 2024 and head into a new year, we naturally start to think about making New Year's resolutions, like going to the gym. We all start out with big goals, but did you know that only 8% of people will stick with their resolutions all year long? But what if you could make your resolutions automatic? Well, Acorns can't help you get to the gym, but they make it easy to start automatically saving and investing so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. And you don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. And you don't need a ton of time, unlike going to the gym. You can create your Acorns account and start investing in just 5 minutes. Head to acorns.com/CW or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/CW. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 484 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, when we left off last time, after 2 days of intense combat in the wilderness during the first week of May 1864, neither side could claim victory. The Federals, with a force almost 102,000 strong, had suffered more than 17,500 casualties. The Confederates, with a little over 61,000 men engaged, had suffered about 13,000 killed, wounded, or missing.
Previously, Federal commanders in the Eastern Theater, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, they'd all retreated after experiencing setbacks or suffering defeats. The campaign would be over, but the war would go on, and the Union soldiers understood they'd just have to do it all over again, some other time.
But here, on May 7th, after 2 days of fierce fighting in the wilderness, the Union soldiers realized this time was going to be different, because Ulysses S. Grant had no intention of retreating. Yes, he was going to break the grapple with the Confederates in the wilderness, but instead of retreating, he was going to slide to the southeast, around the rebels' right flank, and head for Spotsylvania Court House, where he'd be squarely between Robert E. Lee and Richmond.
When we left off last time, the Federal soldiers were cheering Ulysses S. Grant and lighting his way through the dark forest, but Grant was worried that all the carrying on would give away the Army's movements.
As it turned out, though, he need not have worried, since Robert E. Lee already suspected the Army of the Potomac was heading for Spotsylvania Court House. Unlike the panicky Union general who accosted Grant on the night of May 6th, Lee didn't believe his adversary could perform double somersaults. As far as he could see, Grant had 4 options.
1, Grant could withdraw back across the Rapidan and close down the campaign.
Or he could continue the fighting for a 3rd day.
Or he could march east out of the wilderness to Fredericksburg and then turn south.
Or Grant could strike toward Richmond by the most direct route open to him, which would mean marching for Spotsylvania Court House.
As the sun rose over the smoldering woodlands on the morning of Saturday, May 7th, it became obvious that Grant wasn't going to renew the fighting there in the wilderness, nor would Lee do so. Instead, as one soldier recalled, the two armies faced each other, hunkered down behind their fieldworks, quote, panting like two dogs after a hard fight.
Nevertheless, the Federals and Confederates still probed and skirmished, and up near the Rapidan, rebel patrols discovered that the road to Germanna Ford was no longer defended. That was because Grant had given orders for the pontoon bridges there to be taken up and sent east to Ely's Ford, where the additional spans would let the Federal wounded be evacuated across the river that much faster. In any case, since it was no longer necessary for the Federals to defend Germanna Ford, Sedgwick pulled back his right or northern flank slightly to better defensive ground.
When Lee received the news that the Yankees were no longer defending Germanna Ford on the Rapidan, he concluded the enemy was going to shift his line of communication and supply to the east, so it would run through Fredericksburg. Logically, that meant Grant wasn't going to retreat.
Since Grant also hadn't renewed the fighting there in the wilderness, that meant he was either going to march east to Fredericksburg or south to Spotsylvania. Of the two possibilities, a Federal lunge towards Spotsylvania was the more dangerous for the Confederates. The village itself was of no consequence. It was merely the county seat of Spotsylvania County. What mattered was the area's road network.
Because there, the Brock Road intersected with one from Fredericksburg and two others that connected with the main road to Richmond. Spotsylvania lay barely 10 miles south of the Wilderness battlefield, and the Federals were closer to it than Lee.
If Grant got there first, he'd be squarely between the Confederate Army and Richmond. Lee would then have to retreat fast or attack the Federals in open country, where the superior Yankee numbers would put the rebels at a severe disadvantage. Precisely because marching to Spotsylvania was the most dangerous thing Grant could do, Lee gambled that was just what Grant would do.
By 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 7th, Robert E. Lee had issued orders to Confederate Cavalry Commander Jeb Stuart to put his horsemen out on the roads leading to Spotsylvania.
But if Grant was indeed striking for Spotsylvania, just putting Stuart's cavalry in motion wasn't going to be a sufficient response. Lee also had to get the rebel infantry moving. Of special importance in this regard was Longstreet's Corps, still located on the Orange Plank Road, but manning field works that extended south for more than a mile. As the corps closest to Spotsylvania, it was the obvious choice to lead the march.
However, there were two problems. First, with James Longstreet badly wounded and knocked out of action, a division commander, Major General Richard Anderson, was now leading the corps. Anderson's combat record was mixed, and it remained to be seen whether a merely competent division commander could handle the expanded responsibilities of leading a corps, especially with the prospect of an urgent night march directly ahead.
The second problem was the absence of a direct route to Spotsylvania from Anderson's current position. As matters stood, his divisions would have to first countermarch to Parker's Store, some 3 miles to the rear, before they could turn south. This was far from ideal, since the Federals had a straight shot down the Brock Road. So that Anderson's divisions wouldn't have to backtrack to start their march, Robert E. Lee directed his chief of artillery, Brigadier General William Nelson Pendleton, to construct a military road leading directly to the Catharpin Road, 4 miles south. With so little time available, Pendleton didn't build much of a road. barely a track through the tangled terrain of the wilderness, infantry could use it, but not Anderson's artillery, so the guns would still have to swing around by way of Parker's store.
Lee personally gave Anderson his orders. Anderson was to pull his divisions out of line just as soon as it was dark enough on the evening of May 7th to hide the movement from the enemy. Then, quote, "When you have done this, march the troops a little to the rear and let them have their sleep. At 3 o'clock punctually, march towards Spotsylvania Court House. I have reason to believe that the enemy is withdrawing his forces from our front and will strike us next at that point. I wish you to be there to meet him, and in order to do so, you must be in motion by 3 o'clock in the morning."
Well, as it turned out, Dick Anderson had his troops underway as early as 10 p.m. You see, he expected to march them only a mile or two before halting and letting them get some sleep, as Lee had instructed. But having the men stop there on the track Pendleton had hurriedly hacked through the wilderness would make for a very rough bivouac. And besides, the surrounding woodlands still burned from fires touched off during the battle. Even after the column reached unburned country, Anderson still couldn't find a suitable spot where his two divisions could stop and rest. And so the corps plowed on through the darkness, with the men becoming steadily more exhausted as the night wore on.
To the east a few miles, the Federals were having a similarly nightmarish experience. George Meade got his troops moving around 8:30 on the evening of the 7th. Warren's 5th Corps marched down the Brock Road, while Sedgwick's 6th Corps took a route that carried it through Chancellorsville. Burnside's 9th Corps and Hancock's 2nd Corps served as the Army's rear guard.
The Federals did not move quickly. Delayed by ambulances packed with wounded, Sedgwick got almost nowhere. Warren tried to forge ahead, but his column was backed up for miles. Colonel Charles S. Wainwright noted in his journal, quote, "The road was literally jammed with troops moving one step at a time." Wainwright eventually discovered the problem was, quote, "a couple of 100 yards of wet road over which the water ran an inch deep and where the men were picking their way one at a time." Wainwright could hardly believe it. Yes, every officer and enlisted man in the Army was tired, and yes, the night was dark. But the very fact the Army was making a night march, quote, "was enough to tell every man that we wanted to reach some place without Lee knowing it, and one would think that a desire for their own safety would spur them all up to do it, so as to avoid a fight."
The Army of the Potomac's Provost Marshal, Brigadier General Marcena Patrick, declared the march one of the most disgraceful he ever witnessed. George Meade would have agreed, and the Federal Army commander grew steadily more exasperated as the night wore on.
George Meade's breaking point came when he reached Todd's Tavern at the junction of the Brock Road and Catharpin Road. There he discovered two Union cavalry divisions taking their ease, with horses tethered and troopers asleep in the tavern yard and surrounding fields.
Meade knew Union cavalrymen weren't supposed to be anywhere near Todd's Tavern, since he himself had ordered Phil Sheridan to cover the Army's movement to Spotsylvania, and so every trooper ought to have been out patrolling the region's roads.
Well, obviously Sheridan wasn't carrying out Meade's orders. When Meade questioned the two division commanders, Brigadier Generals David McMurtry Gregg and Wesley Merritt, neither man knew anything about a night march to Spotsylvania. They were bivouacked at Todd's Tavern because their outfits had engaged in a stiff fight with Jeb Stuart's rebel horsemen there earlier in the day.
As we've indicated in previous episodes, Phil Sheridan, as far as Meade was concerned, had been nothing but trouble since Ulysses S. Grant had brought him in from the Western Theater and placed him in charge of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps.
No sooner had Sheridan arrived on the scene than he demanded the Army's horse soldiers perform less picket duty so that they could be freed up for more important activities, like battling the rebel cavalry. Meade did his best to accommodate Sheridan, only to see the Union cavalry turn in a subpar performance during the Wilderness fight, during which Phil Sheridan spent most of his time ignoring Meade's orders, choosing instead to spar with Jeb Stuart in meaningless clashes that did little except satisfy Sheridan's personal combative streak. For example, a dispatch from Sheridan characterized the just concluded clash at Todd's Tavern as, quote, sharp and hotly contested. And he added, quote, our cavalry behaved splendidly. Well, be that as it may, the plain truth was that Sheridan was clearly failing to carry out his primary mission, which was to screen the Army's movement and to gather information about the enemy's strength and dispositions.
On May 4th, the Confederates had been able to close with the Army of the Potomac in the Wilderness before anyone was aware they were nearby.
Meade fought on May 5th, not knowing how many rebels he was facing or even where they were located there in the Wilderness.
And because Sheridan failed to get past Jeb Stuart and obtain reliable information about Confederate dispositions, Hancock on May 6th needed to leave some of his best troops on the Brock Road to guard against a possible flank attack from that direction.
However, nothing could be done about Sheridan now at 1 o'clock in the morning, so Meade instead gave orders directly to Gregg and Merritt. He knew that to reach Spotsylvania, both Federals and Confederates would have to cross the Po River, a minor stream that nevertheless was enough of an obstacle that the armies could only get across it at a few bridges. For that reason, Meade sent the cavalrymen off to block the 2 spans the Confederates would have to use if they marched for Spotsylvania. Gregg received instructions to ride to Corbin's Bridge, where the Catarpin Road crossed the Po. Part of Merritt's orders required him to picket the Blockhouse Bridge.
The move to the Blockhouse would carry Wesley Merritt's horsemen through Spotsylvania. Meade stressed to Merritt, quote, it is of the utmost importance that not the slightest delay occur in your opening the Brock Road beyond Spotsylvania Court House, as an infantry corps is now on its way to occupy that place.
While the 2 officers went off to ready their divisions to move, Meade sent a message to Sheridan, telling him, I find Generals Gregg and Merritt without orders. They are in the way of the infantry, and there is no time to refer to you. I have given them the enclosed orders, which you can modify today after the infantry corps are in position. And with that, George Meade lay down to grab what sleep he could.
Whether you're ordering wings for the game, whipping up a 7-layer dip, or ordering pizza, there's something about football that makes you want to eat. And this football season, Uber Eats has the best deals on game day food. No matter what you're craving, from 2-for-1 pizza to buy one, get one wings, Uber Eats will be dropping new deals each week, all season long. Uber Eats, official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now. Terms and conditions apply. See app for details.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Even as George Meade lay down to grab what sleep he could, Gregg and Merritt's troopers hauled themselves from their bedrolls and saddled their horses. It took over an hour for the 2 divisions to ready themselves and mount up but by 3 o'clock on the morning of Sunday, May 8th, they were on the road.
David McMurtry Gregg rode west along the Catarpin Road, while Wesley Merritt led his men south down the Brock Road. Gregg encountered little trouble, but Merritt got barely 2 miles before he encountered trees that had been felled across the road. As some of the Federals dismounted to deal with this obvious roadblock, they were met by a volley of shots from rebel cavalry.
As it turned out, the dismounted rebel cavalrymen from Fitz Lee's division were backed up by artillery. A brisk fight developed, and Merritt brought more and more men forward and pumped them into the action, until by daylight he had his entire division engaged with the Confederates.
But the stubborn rebels refused to withdraw, and finally Merritt threw in the towel. At 6 a.m., he requested infantry support. The nearest Federal foot soldiers belonged to Brigadier General John C. Robinson's division of Warren's Corps, which was a mile back up the road. From the porch of Todd's Tavern, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Lyman, from Meade's staff, noted that by this time the men were making good progress and, quote, passing at a rapid rate. In light order they were, many without knapsacks or coats. Most had thrown away all baggage but a blanket and haversack.
When Gouverneur K. Warren received Merritt's call for help, he sent Robinson's lead brigade hustling forward. As the brigade neared the scene of the fighting between the opposing cavalrymen, it ran into an unknown officer barking orders as if he were emperor of the world. Asked to identify himself, the officer snapped, "Sheridan."
Sure enough, the fiery commander of the Federals' Cavalry Corps was there, and he personally deployed the Union infantry regiments into line of battle, punctuating his orders with an impatient, "Quick! Quick!" By this time, the sun was well above the horizon, and the day was already starting to heat up. Robinson's men shoved back the rebels, rapidly at first, since with Yankee infantry on the scene, the Confederate horsemen no longer tried to make a determined stand. But the Federal foot soldiers were bone tired after their night march and then hustling forward to help Merritt's troopers, so fatigue and the rising temperatures quickly took their toll, and many of his men dropped by the wayside as Robinson pursued the backpedaling rebels.
When the Federals reached the edge of a large field, Robinson went ahead to get a good look at what lay beyond it. About 400 yards down the road, he saw a grove of pine trees. The intervening ground rose slightly toward the grove, not much, but just enough to create a good, clear field of fire for the rebels.
At the edge of the grove, Fitz Lee's troopers had quickly cut down some of the pine trees to use as abatis, and as Robinson watched, they speedily piled up fence rails to make a crude breastwork. Clearly, the Confederates had picked this piece of high ground, soon dubbed Laurel Hill, to make a determined defensive stand.
With the Confederates evidently determined to make a stand at Laurel Hill, Gouverneur K. Warren and John C. Robinson had a quick consultation. Warren wanted Robinson to push forward immediately before the enemy could strengthen his defenses or receive reinforcements.
But Robinson pointed out that only his lead brigade was up, and he preferred to wait for the rest of his division to arrive, then have everyone go forward at once. Warren reluctantly agreed to the delay, but then quickly reversed himself. He thought the advantage of making an immediate attack outweighed the potential benefits of waiting for more troops to come up.
Robinson's lead brigade was commanded by Colonel Peter Lyle. At Robinson's order, Lyle led his men forward. They got within 60 yards of the Confederate position before they received a staggering volley from the rebels. Lyle's men promptly took cover in a shallow depression that cut across the open ground in front of the enemy works.
As more brigades of Federals came up, including some from Charles Griffin's division, each brigade was fed into the fighting as soon as it arrived. in some cases so fast that the men didn't realize they were taking part in an assault until they heard the actual command to advance. Warren tried to inspire them by shouting, "Never mind the cannon, never mind the bullets, clear this road, it's the only way to get your rations." And a Union colonel who heard Warren thought this was highly appropriate motivation, since most of his men were ravenous because their haversacks contained not so much as a piece of hardtack.
Robinson, on horseback, advanced with his troops, quote, "knowing that my brave men would follow wherever I led the way." John Robinson was instantly recognizable. A soldier who served under him said he was, quote, "the hairiest man in a much-bearded army." His men called him Old Reliable, and the sight of their division commander leading them forward boosted the morale of the hungry, tired soldiers.
Robinson was trying to coordinate the attack of the units east of the Brock Road with those west of it, hoping to put together a single hard blow instead of a succession of piecemeal assaults by single brigades. But the task proved to be impossible. Time after time, the rebels let the Yankees close to within 60 yards or so, then smashed them with massed volleys. Robinson was knocked out of the action when a bullet smashed his left knee. The leg would have to be amputated, ending the Civil War career of the hairiest man in a much-bearded army.
With Robinson down, the Federal assault on Laurel Hill fell apart, and the survivors pulled back. A colonel recalled that the withdrawal was an ordeal. Quote, "The sun was so hot and the men so exhausted from the long run, as well as from the 5 days and nights of fighting and marching, that this retreat, though disorderly, was also exceedingly slow, and we lost heavily in consequence from the enemy's fire. My own experience was that, wishing to run, I could only limp along, using my sword as a cane."
At some point during their assaults, the exhausted Federals had realized that they were not facing merely Confederate cavalry, but rebel infantry as well. The enemy foot soldiers belonged to Anderson's corps, which, as we said, had been marching all night, and now swung in from the Shady Grove Road west of Spotsylvania. The lead division belonged to Brigadier General Joseph Kershaw, who sent 2 of his 4 brigades double-quicking to Laurel Hill, where they arrived just in time to help repel the Federals' initial attacks. Jeb Stuart himself directed them into line, telling them, "Hold your fire until the Federals are well within range, and then give it to them, and hold this position to the last man. Plenty of help is near at hand."
Kershaw's other 2 brigades hustled on to Spotsylvania Court House to claim the village before the advancing Union Cavalry Division of Brigadier General James Wilson could seize it. Wilson, in fact, got there first, but Sheridan ordered him to pull back, since he feared the unsupported Wilson would suffer a disaster if he stayed there.
Meanwhile, with the repulse of his assault on Laurel Hill, Gouverneur K. Warren pulled his men back several hundred yards inside the tree line across the clearing from the Confederate position, then brought up the balance of his corps and began extending his line to the east. When he informed George Meade that he had rebel infantry in front of him, Meade at first couldn't believe it. It hardly seemed possible that rebel infantry, with farther to march, had reached Spotsylvania ahead of him. But Warren insisted that was exactly what had happened, and he needed reinforcements.
Meade therefore ordered Sedgwick's 6th Corps, which was approaching from Todd's Tavern, to deploy on Warren's left, after which both corps were to attack, quote, "with vigor and without delay."
By this time, George Meade was intensely frustrated. His orders during the recent fighting in the wilderness had been repeatedly questioned or ignored. The just completed night march had been botched, and now the presence of Confederate infantry at Laurel Hill was evidence that Sheridan's cavalry hadn't carried out his orders to seize the Po River bridges and block the enemy's route to Spotsylvania.
Meade's famous volcanic temper was about to blow. He summoned Phil Sheridan to Army headquarters and, when Sheridan arrived, read him the riot act. Meade said that not only had Sheridan failed to impede the rebel infantry's advance to Spotsylvania, but he'd also allowed Gregg's and Merritt's divisions of horsemen to slow down the march of the Federal infantry.
Sheridan, every bit as mad as Meade, exploded. He said the Confederate infantry had gotten by only because Meade had given orders directly to Gregg and Merritt, leaving Sheridan with only Wilson, who reached Spotsylvania but was unsupported. Sheridan said he couldn't continue to command the Army's cavalry if Meade was going to give orders to his subordinates. Further, he was sick of this business of Meade expecting him to screen the Army, when, as far as Sheridan was concerned, the Federal cavalry's main job was to battle the enemy cavalry. If Meade would just leave him alone, Phil Sheridan declared, he would whip Jeb Stuart out of his boots.
All who witnessed it agreed that Sheridan's obscenity-laced outburst was not merely insubordinate, but his entire attitude communicated the contempt he felt for Meade. After Sheridan left, George Meade went straight to Ulysses S. Grant, no doubt hoping that Grant would agree to reprimand or relieve Sheridan, or perhaps even urge his arrest.
Instead, Grant listened calmly as Meade told him what had happened, perking up only when Meade got to the part where Sheridan declared he could whip Jeb Stuart if Meade would only leave him alone. "Did Sheridan say that?" Grant asked. "Well, he generally knows what he is talking about. Let him start right out and do it."
Although George Meade couldn't have been happy at Grant's response, he dutifully composed an order for Sheridan to, quote, proceed against the enemy's cavalry, end quote. However, it was probably no accident that the orders included instructions that would carry Sheridan as far away from the Army of the Potomac as possible.
Sheridan was instructed to take his supply trains with him, and when those were exhausted, he was to resupply his cavalry at Hacksaw's Landing on the James River, which was over 60 miles away. Then, having disposed of the matter, however unhappily, George Meade returned to the business of ejecting the Confederates from Laurel Hill.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is The Battles for Spotsylvania Court House and the Road to Yellow Tavern, May 7th through 12th, 1864, by Gordon C. Ray.
This is the second volume in Gordon C. Ray's 5-book series on the Overland Campaign, and all 5 deserve a spot on your Civil War bookshelf. The first that we recommended was The Battle of the Wilderness, of course, and then this one, The Battles for Spotsylvania Court House and the Road to Yellow Tavern.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
At the website, you can also find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like John D. and Alex P. did this past week.
A big thank you to them, and thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.